Welcome to the day in history for May 7th. Today is the day that King Louis XIV of France inaugurates or officially opens the Palace of Versailles. Now, there was a few other days in history that I had thought about doing. One of them we did last year, which was Beethoven's Ninth Symphony. Dun 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 dun, the Ode to Joy. But we already talked about Beethoven just a couple weeks ago, so I decided to find something new. It was one of those kind of slow history days. There wasn't a whole lot, but then I found the Palace of Versailles. This place is amazing. So today, in 1664, the Palace of Versailles is inaugurated. And once you see some of the pictures, you'll see why I gave you this big idea. The big idea for today is royalty lived in a whole different world. So, I'll let you write this down. And let's go. Now, we are at the Palace of Versailles, which is about 11 miles outside of Paris. Now, this is pretty important because Paris has historically been the capital of France. Yet King Louis XIV, for a few reasons, decided to move his palace and the entire government outside of Paris. Now, this is King Louis XIV. He was an extravagant king, a rich king, a king that started a lot of wars, and a very powerful king. Because at this time, France was the superpower in Europe. Now, King Louis, when he was 9, there was an uprising of nobles. Now, I'm going to simplify this because we're going to talk about it for just like a minute. But many nobles kind of revolted against the royalty and the king. And it wasn't until 1654 that the kind of revolt was put down and King Louis XIV was crowned as king. Now, he was kind of mad at these nobles, because they revolted, and he never really forgave them. And that's going to be important when we talk about the Palace of Versailles and what it meant. Now, he married the daughter of the King of Spain. And so now you have the King of France married to the daughter of Spain, and you can see how it made for a very, very powerful combination. So, France was a superpower. Like I said, France, and we've talked about this in the 100 Years' War, the 30 Years' War, the, what was the big battle of Agincourt? Like, there has been a lot of stuff going on in France. And France has always been a fairly powerful country. Even after King Louis XIV, later on, after the French Revolution, we have Napoleon, which is another huge, powerful French leader. So, France has a history of being a superpower. Now, he decided to move from this palace in in Paris, to the Temple of Versailles. And he actually moved that actual seat of government, or where the king lived, in 1682, because it took a while to build the Palace of Versailles. Now, the Palace of Versailles started out as a hunting lodge. And the story goes is that when King Louis XIV was a kid, he would spend time here and he really liked it. Now, it was a very small, pretty much like hideaway out in the woods. It wasn't that far from Paris, so they could get there pretty quick. But King Louis XIV decided to turn this into his new palace. It was opulent. It was amazingly rich in decor and design, and it was huge. Now, I did see one website that said that King Louis XIV spent half of the country's money for a year. So if you took all the money that France made in 1 year, he took half of it to build that. I don't know. But I also saw from a PBS website that they see that the actual cost in today's dollars was anywhere between $2 billion and $300 billion. And it's really hard to put a price tag on something this long ago. But even if it is just $2 billion, that's $2 billion for a building. And if it's anywhere in between $100 billion, oh my gosh. And when you see some of these pictures, you're going to see why It was so expensive. Now, the temple, or excuse me, it kind of was like a temple, but the palace was set up in a way so that it was just fantastic. It had a huge impact. And there were a couple reasons for that. One, you wanted to make sure that if you're the king of one of the most powerful countries in Europe, that your palace is going to reflect that. You don't want to live in a small little palace. You want it to be amazing. And that's what he did. Now, there's a couple reasons why he did this. One was probably to make it an amazing palace for the king, but it was also to change the way the government in France worked. Now, before this, the nobles had a lot of power. And when I speak of nobles, I'm talking about all the other rich families around France. And some of them revolted against King Louis. And so he decided to bring them all to the Palace of Versailles and have them live there so that he could control them in a way. And he set up a lifestyle at this palace that it was like a play. It was scripted. Almost everything was scripted. Now, we'll talk more about that when we get to some of the rooms. But if you look at this picture, hold on, Penny, go back one. There we go. Sorry, Penny's helping me. So if you look here, this was a giant ballroom, and it was amazing. And King Louis did not give these nobles a lot of important jobs in the country. King Louis decided to run the country himself. And so he gave all these other kind of unimportant jobs to these nobles to keep them busy. They did games, all kinds of dances and balls and fancy dinners, and everything had like a set of rules that they would follow as part of their duty as nobles. And as the nobles took these jobs, they quit kind of messing with running the country, and that's what King Louis wanted. Now, let's take a look at some of the places in this palace. This is by far the most famous room in the palace. This is the Hall of Mirrors. Now, this was a giant long hallway filled with mirrors and windows. Now, it doesn't sound that amazing unless you realize that we're talking about the 1660s and the 60s, 70s. Mirrors were very, very hard to make. And so all of a sudden, this very expensive item, this mirror, you now have an entire hallway filled with them. That just says, I am rich, I am powerful. If you look at the ceilings, they are opulently decorated with all kinds of frescoes and beautiful paintings, and this was found throughout the entire palace. Pretty crazy. Now, this is the king's bedroom. The king's bedroom was set so that at a certain time of the day, and you can kind of see it down there on the floor, the sun would come in and light the king's bed. Now, like I said, everything was kind of scripted, or they had a plan. When the king got up, they would have a bunch of nobles come in and watch the king get dressed. Yeah, they had a whole ceremony for the king getting dressed, for the king going to bed, for all of these things. They even had nobles that were assigned the excellent and very important job of taking out the chamber pot. Now, if you don't know what a chamber pot is, they didn't have toilets. And so you would go poop and pee in a little pot in your room, and then someone would take it out. That was somebody's important job. Now, a little side note, this place didn't have plumbing. And so most of all of the human waste was in pots, and then they would go dump it. And it's said that the palace was beautiful, but it smelled like poop and pee because there was so many people there. At the height, there were over 10,000 people living at this palace. 10,000, and they're all going to the bathroom. Now, at the same time, perfume, and we've talked about perfume and spices as part of the Silk Road, remember that? But this is one of the reasons why people bought all these perfume and spices, is because poop stinks. Do you guys know that poop stinks? Yeah, it stinks. That's why we have fans in our bathrooms, okay? They didn't have fans. And so, perfume and spices. But this is the king's bedroom. Pretty crazy. Now, The queen had a bedroom that was very similar. And what was cool is the Palace of Versailles, when it was first built, it had matching like rooms or matching buildings on each side. So the king's side was just like the queen's side. So this is the queen's bedroom. And like I said, they had a whole set of rituals that they would go through each day. Eating, getting dressed, going to bed, all kinds of stuff. It was pretty cool. Now, the gardens here are absolutely amazing. This is like straight out of like a fantasy fairy tale book. This is the like where you have like the hedge mazes and the amazing grass work and pathways and fountains. I can just imagine a bunch of people dressed up in their noble kingly attire, queenly gowns, walking around, talking about who knows what. But this was the setting for that sort of activity. Pretty crazy. Now, the gardens, as you can see here, were extravagant. They were huge. I can't even imagine how hard it would have been to take care of all of these plants and stuff. But it turned out to be a pretty amazing garden. Now, this is the what they call the Domaine de Maria Antoinette. Now, this was a cottage built to look like a peasant's house, so that Maria Antoinette, one of the later French important people, could go and kind of get away from the palace life. But it's kind of interesting that you have this crazy, fancy palace, but then you have like this replica or copy or model of like a peasant's house nearby. Kind of strange. Now, there was also the king's grand apartments, which were other places for the king to work. I kind of thought this was a cool picture with the globe coming apart. But this place was crazy. It was amazing. Now, nowadays, it is the second most visited place in France. If I were to ask you what's the most visited place in France, you'd probably say the Eiffel Tower, but that's wrong. The number one place is the Louvre. The second is the Palace of Versailles. And after doing this research, I can totally see why. Because this place was absolutely amazing. But you also have to remember how much money was spent on it. Not only a bunch of money to build it, but a bunch of money to run it. And all of that money, when you think about it, could have been used for a lot of other things, like maybe taking better care of the peasants. But that's not how people really saw it back in the 1660s. So, today's day in history, Palace of Versailles. If you go on Google and type virtual tour of Palace of Versailles, I'm sure you can find some pretty cool stuff. So, guys, thank you very much. See you.